Is Geoff Kaufman and its work with Mary Flanagan. So it's high-low splits, divergent, cognitive, constructual levels triggered by digital and non-digital platforms. So thank you.
Thank you. Full disclosure, this talk is actually quite different from the rest of the talks in this session. I was pretty confused why it was scheduled for this session, and I thought the first few talks would help clear things up, but in fact, I think I'm more confused about why this talk is here. So I apologize in advance for the divergence, maybe a brief departure from the topic before we return to the last speaker who's going to get us back on track. But in essence, the research I'll be presenting today. Oh, that's not what I wanted. As I'm setting up, as I'm hopefully going to figure out how to prevent that from happening, I can give you a brief introduction to tell you this work is looking at maybe at a broad level, there is some connection with the other talks in that it focuses on the affordances of technology and how they might affect interaction with those technologies. But it's focused more on how digital versus non-digital talks, or digital versus non-digital platforms might lead to different levels of construal or interpretation of information. Let me turn off presenter view here. Great. And this is work that I did as a postdoc at the Tilt Factor Game Design and Research Laboratory at Dartmouth College. As we're all familiar, there's been a host of news reports about the apparent deterioration of human cognition as a result of the ubiquity of modern digital technologies. So the work I'll be presenting today is sort of a reaction to the sensationalism of these types of reports to look at a more scientific approach to understanding how digital technologies might be affecting cognition more generally, or more broadly speaking, how digital platforms might be activating or triggering a different default mindset or interpretive framework or lens that might affect how information is processed. And this talk is based on the psychological concept of a construal level, the idea that you can interpret or see or view information or stimuli or events at different levels of abstraction, either based on personal preference or by contextual factors that activate or trigger one level of interpretation or another. So on the one hand, we might be able to interpret an event or behavior or stimulus more concretely, using a more local processing style focused on more unstructured, contextualized, detail-oriented elements of the event or stimulus. Or we can focus more abstractly, more globally or holistically on the overall decontextualized gist or meaning of the event or stimulus. So for example, you might construe your own participation in the CHI conference or the session today more concretely by focusing on the fact that you're attending sessions or taking notes or sitting in lecture halls. Or you can construe the same event more abstractly, thinking about how you're gaining knowledge or being a member of the CHI community or enhancing your own professional endeavors and so forth. And construal level theory proposed by Trope and Lieberman suggests that one key factor that pushes people from one level of construal to another is the level of distance psychologically you have between yourself and that stimulus. So at a lower level of distance, you're more likely to construe the same event or stimulus more concretely. At a higher level of distance, when there's some separation or gap between you and the stimulus, you're more likely to exhibit a more abstract interpretation or construal of it. So the basic research question that guided the work I'll be presenting today is the notion that with all other factors held constant, does the simple fact that you're processing information on a digital versus non-digital platform affect the default level of construal or interpretation of that information? And to give you sort of a foreshadow of the premise behind the work, we looked at the key idea that digital platforms might be inviting a more concrete, lower level focus compared to non-digital platforms and a lower reliance on abstract thought. And our own work at Tilt Factor, which as I mentioned earlier is a game design and research laboratory, hinted that this might be the case. So in one study, we looked at a basic comparison of a digital and non-digital instantiation of the same strategy game and found vast differences in how players approached the game. In particular, with the digital version of the game, shown here on the right, an iPad application, we found that players were much more likely to utilize the immediate localized solutions to the game's problems. In this case, the deployment of vaccinations on the board to prevent the spread of disease in this game called Pox. And we found compared to players of a board game, those players of the iPad version were much more likely to exhibit these more localized immediate solutions and not think about the downstream consequences of their actions. So even though it was exactly the same game, we found vast differences in the types of cognitive processes that players were exhibiting in response to the game's sort of required system. And as a result, players of the digital version were actually much less likely to win the game, in large part because they weren't considering the broader downstream effects of their decisions. So this led us to believe that there might be some general effect of digital technologies that might be leading to lower levels or lower inclinations to exhibit abstract thought or abstract construals of the same situation or stimulus. And so that's the basic premise for the work I'll be presenting today. So we conducted 4 quantitative randomized controlled studies, basically comparing directly the processing of information on a digital platform versus a non-digital platform. And in all these studies, we attempted to hold as many factors constant as we could between the digital and non-digital instantiation. We presented the same information using as many of the same variables. So for example, the same type font and size, the same distance between individuals and the information itself, and so forth, to isolate the effective platform on construal levels. And we tested this basic idea across many different information processing tasks and contexts, which I'll be discussing briefly given the limitations of time as we go through. But I'm happy to answer any more detailed questions about methodology, either in the Q&A or afterward. So the first study basically was an attempt to show at its most basic level that digital platforms can affect construal levels by relying on a convenient measure that psychologists have developed to actually measures construal level preferences, called the behavior identification form. So this form presents participants with 25 different everyday actions, and along with those, 2 different possible alternative descriptions for those behaviors, one which is more abstract in nature, one which is more concrete in nature. And it simply asks respondents to choose which one in that moment they think they would prefer to use to describe that event or behavior. So for example, you can construe making a list either more concretely in terms of writing things down or more abstractly in terms of getting organized. So every item was of the same fashion. You're making a choice between an abstract and a concrete construal of the same basic behavior. And we implemented this scale itself either on an iPad or a physical printout, just to see if the difference in platform would affect the default level of preference for abstract versus concrete construals of the same behaviors. So everything else, as I mentioned, was held constant. We simply wanted to see the effective platform on responses to this validated measure of construal level. And we found, in general, that the non-digital instantiation of the survey, a paper and pencil version, elicited higher levels of preference for abstract descriptions compared to the digital iPad instantiation of the same exact survey. So in essence, this amounts to about a 25% increase in abstract construals in the non-digital version, or in other words, a 25% decrease in preference for abstract descriptions on an iPad, all other factors being held constant. So this gave us a first glimpse that might be this general effect of platform lowering reliance on abstract interpretations of the same information. In study 2, we transferred to a very different domain, the domain of reading comprehension, by presenting participants with a short story written by David Sedaris on either an iPad or a paper printout. So in this case, we're looking at the extent to which people processed a narrative, either through the lens that was more concrete or more abstract. And we chose a story by Sedaris that was very rich both in details and possible inferences or implications of the events or behaviors depicted in it. And we tested memory and comprehension for the events of the story in a surprise test afterward, which included both 12 inference-focused questions and 12 detail-focused questions, like the ones you see here on the screen, just to see if there'd be a difference in performance on inference versus detail-oriented questions, inference questions being more abstract in nature, detail questions being more concrete. And again, all factors were held uniform across the iPad and paper versions of the story. And we found the performance did differ quite dramatically based on the platform. So we found on the inference questions, for example, that participants in the digital version performed worse. They answered fewer questions correctly, which involved implications or inferences, whereas they did better when the questions involved specific details from the story. So in other words, there was a dramatic effect or difference between the detail and inference-related questions for the iPad participants, but not for the non-digital participants. In a final study, which is quite complicated in this methodology, I'll just give you the gist of it. It involved a problem-solving task for which other work has shown that a more abstract mindset, a more gist-focused mindset, led to better performance. It presented basically an information overload, a ton of information about different car models and their features. That other work has shown if you focus too much on the details, you actually don't discern the correct answer in terms of which of these car models is superior. The bottom line is that just processing allows respondents to figure out which of those categories is actually the most important more easily. So focusing on details would actually lead to worse performance. And we administered this task either on a laptop or a paper form and found the performance, again, dramatically differed. Participants who answered the same exact questions on a laptop performed worse. They were much less likely to figure out the correct answer. And finally, in one last study I'll just mention briefly, we wanted to see if one way of counteracting this effect might be to activate or prime a more abstract mindset for users of laptops. So we took exactly the same procedure and had participants undergo a task that was meant to activate a more abstract mindset by having them focusing on increasingly abstract reasons for engaging in certain behaviors like pursuing healthy actions. And we found that doing so actually reversed this trend. Activating this more abstract mindset ahead of time led participants who were using the laptop to perform better on this task, which is increasing evidence that when you can find ways of activating an abstract mindset, it counteracts this tendency for users of digital technologies to exhibit lower levels of construal. I know I'm out of time, but just to conclude, the next steps in this research is to basically understand what the underlying mechanism is for why this effect might have occurred. We saw it was fairly robust across different domains. The next step is to figure out why this occurs and to what other domains or decision-making tasks it might apply. So I'll close there, and thank you very much. Is there time for one question?
No, unfortunately not.
I'm happy to stay afterward. Thank you.